When we last left off, we had looked at Descartes' negative project, his destructive phase, as I called it. Basically, he was tearing down beliefs with a machete, right? He was trying to knock down beliefs as quickly as possible because what he wanted to know is what he knew with certainty, and that required that he got rid of every belief that he didn't know with certainty. And it was pretty brutal, right? It was quite violent. And it was the evil demon argument that took us to that possibility, hey, maybe we don't know anything at all. What I would like to do in this lesson is rehash that argument in perhaps a more modern fashion. So let me introduce you to Nick Bostrom. Mr. Bostrom is a very prolific philosopher and quite famous as far as modern philosophers go. He is the head of the Future of Humanity Institute, at least as of this recording, and he is known primarily for his views on artificial intelligence. He believes, in a nutshell, that we are on track for creating a super intelligent form of artificial intelligence, and that this poses an existential risk to us humans. It's a bad idea, in a nutshell, is what he's trying to say. And heck, sometimes, depending on how much caffeine I've had, I agree with him. So, that's not the view we're going to cover right now. We're going to look at another famous argument from him called the simulation argument. So let me explain an important concept so that we can get to the simulation argument. It is the post-human stage. Now, what is the post-human stage? That is a stage of technological maturity required to create ancestor simulations. And these ancestor simulations would be sufficiently detailed and, I suppose, fine-grained to include conscious beings. In other words, they are little simulations of human history. And they are so detailed, so granular, that the little people inside are actually conscious. Let me mention something real quick about this before we leave this slide. Why would anyone want this? I can tell you with considerable certainty that a lot of different categories of people would probably want these. First and foremost, probably historians. There's actually already historians who use computer simulations to explore different possibilities and test their hypotheses. One such person is named Peter Turchin. But actually, come to think about it, a lot of different disciplines, different scholars in different disciplines use computer simulations. Right? I think every single one of these people, or almost every single one, would want one of these ancestor simulations, right? It would be the most accurate model you can possibly use. So that sounds likely. I'm guessing if you are in the world of business and you are thinking, hey, should we make this product? Should we fund this movie? Should we whatever, right? Well, one place where you can test those ideas, products, before you actually launch them, movies before you make them, whatever, that would be an ancestor simulation, right? It's almost basically a dry run, right? You're trying things out, but not in the real world, in a simulation. The point I'm trying to make here is that if it ever is the case that humans get to this post-human stage where we do have the technology to make these simulations where the people inside are actually conscious, well, we're probably going to do it. That's my guess, at least. One other thing that I can mention here is that this is quite a big assumption that is being made here, that consciousness is realizable in a computational fashion. What does that mean? Basically, you can make conscious beings in a computer. That's a very big assumption that assumes that something like machine functionalism is true, that, mental states, they're just computational processes. That's a big if, right? So we will discuss that in a lesson in a long time from now. But that is an assumption that is being made here. I just wanted to flag that so that maybe one day we'll talk about it. Okay. Nick Bostrom asks us to think about the following three possibilities. He just basically says, imagine that, ancestor simulations are a thing. What could be the case with regard to these simulations? Well, think of the whole universe and think about all the intelligent civilizations therein. Here's basically the three kinds of possibilities that might be the case. It might be the case that 0 intelligent civilizations ever reach the post-human stage. That is, no intelligent beings anywhere in the universe ever get the technological sophistication to make these little simulations where the people inside are conscious. That's possible. Why might that be the case? Well, maybe every single intelligent civilization destroys itself eventually. It might be the case, and if our intelligent civilization is any indicator of this, that we just don't know how to play with our toys well. Our weapons, they're too powerful, and we just can't agree on not using them, and so we destroy ourselves. It might be the case that there's a great filter such that no intelligent civilization ever acquires these ancestor simulations. Okay, well, that's one depressing thought. Maybe, here's another one. Maybe some intelligent civilizations do reach the post-human stage, but they don't run the simulations. They say to themselves, well, that's kind of messed up, right? All the little people inside these simulations, that is real suffering. Why multiply suffering needlessly? So that's another possibility. For the record, I think that if humans ever achieve the capacity for ancestor simulations, we're probably going to use them. Maybe that's maybe I just haven't had enough caffeine today. I'm being a little negative. Okay, the third possibility is that, of course, some intelligent civilization, maybe us, reaches a post-human stage, and of course, we run these simulations. What Bostrom says is that, knowing nothing else, you might want to label these three equal probabilities, right? They're just as possible. I don't know. You can go ahead and disagree about that. That's not really the point of the argument. The argument really is asking you to really focus on the third scenario. Imagine that humans, for example, really do reach the post-human stage. Well, then that means that you are very likely in a simulation. Why? Well, that's because there would be way more simulations than actual realities. How many actual realities are there? 1. How many simulations would there be? Well, maybe not everyone would have a simulation, but a lot of people would have a simulation. How about half of the population? Okay, well, that's already 4 billion simulations. So what are the odds then that you're in the real reality as opposed to the simulation or one of the simulations? Well, that's about 1 in 4 billion. Those are not good odds, right? And that's just assuming that, half of the population has one simulation. Maybe they don't have one. Maybe they have more than one, right? 2, 3, whatever. And we haven't even gotten to the issue of a simulation within a simulation. Well, that multiplies things exponentially. Basically, your odds are really, really bad. If one day you see on the news, hey, we have finally made simulations where the people inside are actually conscious, you should automatically say to yourself, that means I'm in a simulation, or I'm very likely in a simulation, or it's more likely that I'm in a simulation than not. That's at least what Nick Bostrom wants you to think. Scary, right? Well, when I present this argument to students, they're at least paying attention. That's kind of nice. A couple of things we can say here. First of all, Nick Bostrom and René Descartes have nothing in common. The only reason why I used this example is because it helps you really sort of, almost visualize, maybe seem to visualize a scenario where you really can question everything. Because if you are in a simulation, then it's even the case that, maybe math is all messed up in your simulation. Like they're having you believe that 2 + 3 = 5, but, that's just because the simulation was programmed that way. In reality, it's 6 or whatever, And so if you live in a simulation, it really is the case that you are probably, or can be at least, wrong about everything. Math, logic, your body. You think you have a body, but you're just, binary code, ones and zeros. So if you're in a simulation, literally everything is questionable. And that means that you got no foundational beliefs, right? So that's why I invoked Mr. Bostrom's simulation argument. I'll give you one other comment here that I just want to make sure is clear. Bostrom, he had no epistemic aims with this particular simulation argument. Again, he is not trying to get you to, conclude the same thing that Descartes does, right? So these are completely separate. I just kind of borrowed it very briefly to make that point. And I hope you enjoyed that point. So what are we left with? Do we know nothing with absolute certainty? Well, now we get to Descartes' absolute most famous argument. I'm actually guessing you've heard of it before, even if you don't recognize here my Latin title, the Cogito argument. Cogito being Latin, as I mentioned. So Descartes would say something like, no, I know at least one thing. I know that I exist because I have convinced myself that I can doubt everything, including my own existence. But I can only doubt that I exist if I actually exist. Now, that's kind of the wordy way of making this argument. Sometimes it gets truncated. It just, gets abbreviated to just the following statement. Something to the effect of, I think, therefore I am. Well, that's wonderful, Descartes. That is what that means. I bet you've heard of it before, and now you know what the point of it is. He has found his first foundational belief, but it's not the only one. So let's kind of fast forward a little bit because it's just easier. I'm sorry. Go check out Descartes' Meditations if you want to get the full story. But he, sits there and continues to think. And he realizes, well, there's actually a couple of things that I know. So here are the 4 foundational beliefs that he arrives at. We've already named the first one. He, at the moment, he is thinking must exist, right? So I think, therefore I am. Another one is each phenomenon must have a cause. C, an effect cannot be greater than the cause. And D, the mind has within it the ideas of perfection, space, time, and motion. He says, we come out of the package already understanding space and time and motion and perfection. And he says, yeah, this idea of perfection, it's in there already. So, from these foundational views, Descartes is going to try to, he's going to work his way all the way to science. He's going to say, yeah, everything that we see, the way that we inquire with science, all of that is justified, and it is all based on these 4 foundational truths. Now, to be honest, you can question any one of these and probably find a gap or something. And indeed, we will question 2 of them in this very lesson, A and D, to be precise. But let's just start by taking Descartes at face value. Just, okay, let's take these 4 beliefs, take us all the way to science, Descartes. Take us all the way to the view that that this cup of coffee that I'm looking at is actually real. It's not some kind of figment of my imagination. Get me to the view that I know with 100% certainty that the mug of coffee in front of me is real. It is the way I think it is, right? So, okay, we'll give Descartes the benefit of the doubt, no pun intended. We'll accept these 4 beliefs. Even if you accept those 4 foundational views, it's not clear how this might work out, right? Okay, let me give you the rationale here, or at least the objection. It is not at all clear how one would go from these 4 foundational beliefs to the rest of our beliefs about ourselves, other people, and reality itself. For example, these foundational beliefs seem to be compatible with our existing in a simulation, right? So what do we got? I think, therefore I am. Well, you could be in a simulation. Each phenomenon must have a cause. Sure, that's the way the source code is written. An effect cannot be greater than the cause, says the simulation, and the mind has within it certain ideas. Sure. That's because the programmer put those ideas in your head. Why not? So, it's not the case that Descartes can get us from these 4 beliefs. At least it's not obvious how he takes us from those 4 beliefs to the belief in the world, the way we think that it is, right? So, Descartes does consider this to his credit. And he said, no, I can bridge this gap. I gotcha. He said he could argue and prove that God exists. And because God exists, well, such a being wouldn't let us be deceived about those things of which we have a clear and distinct perception. So I see the, cup of water in front of me. I have a clear and distinct perception about that. Actually, in my case, it's a cup of coffee. And what I can say is, well, it seems like it's there. And Descartes wants to say, well, then it's there. And how is that? Well, you got to your 4 foundational beliefs, and then you have to establish that God exists. And God wouldn't let you be deceived about there being a cup of water or a mug of coffee in front of you. And so that's why you can trust that what you're seeing right now is as it is. So that's the general strategy. His argument, let me give it to you in an unacceptably small nutshell, was that he has an innate idea of a perfect God, right? He says, even if I doubt everything else, I do have this idea of perfection in my mind and of this perfect being, God. And, well, it seems to be the case that that idea was in there before I was born. It was just there already. Okay, well, how did that idea get into the mind? It must be the case that it was provided for, or implanted is maybe a better word, by a perfect being. The idea of perfection can only be implanted into you by a perfect being, which of course is God. Therefore, God exists. I hope that made sense to you. If I could run through the whole thing one more time real quick, here we go. I know I exist. I have, even if I doubt everything else, by the way. Additionally, I have this idea of perfection and a perfect being, and we call that God. And the only way that idea could be in my mind is if that perfect being put it there. And so that perfect being must exist. All right. Well, we should give this a label. This is called an ontological argument because it basically relies on reason and definition, the definition of a perfect being, alone to establish God's existence. There are many ontological arguments in the history of Western and non-Western philosophy. It's all over the place. And historically, at least, Descartes' ontological argument is not a winner, not really well regarded. In fact, even in his own lifetime, Descartes' views were challenged. There was a princess named Elizabeth who was in a long exchange of letters between herself and Descartes. And, it starts off like, hey, help me understand your philosophy. And then it got more like, hey, this part still doesn't make any sense. What about this problem? And it's really nice, though. They're very polite to each other. I wish our letters were this polite. In any case, Elizabeth basically demonstrates that, I'm not sure you got us there, Mr. Descartes. So that is one very unsatisfactory aspect of Descartes' views. Basically, he needs God for his foundational project, and his argument for God's existence is not fabulous. It is not the best thing in the world. So that's one problem. When we accept those four views, it's still not the case that Descartes gets us out of skepticism. He needs God as a ladder, and we're not sure he actually is entitled to that ladder. There are other problems. As I mentioned, I wanted to maybe question some of those foundational beliefs. So let's do that, Here's a philosophical argument or perspective that runs counter to this idea from Descartes, this claim that he knows that he, or I guess his self, his soul, exists as a distinct thing. This is none other than that I think, therefore I am inference. And so let's break it down here. Descartes is basically saying thinking occurs, therefore I know that a self exists. Okay, well, the question that we might pose here, the philosophical puzzle that we're going to cover next, is this. Does the existence of thinking require the existence of a unified self, a thinking thing? Well, this might be easier to understand if I first tell you a little bit of a story. So we are moving into the East, and there is a king named Melinda. And by the way, this is an Indo-Greek king because if you don't know the details, Alexander the Great conquered a ton of stuff, like a lot of territory, and then he died. And members of his entourage, basically, they couldn't keep the empire together, so it just fragmented, and a bunch of Greeks were were in charge of territories, basically all over the place. Really vast distances were run by Greeks. And this is called the Hellenistic Age, by the way. These are usually called Hellenistic kingdoms. And yeah, very famous example is Cleopatra, about a century after the century we're talking about right now. And we're in the 2nd century BCE, right? So Cleopatra, a little bit after this point, she runs Egypt, but she's Greek, right? So it's a mess, but it did happen. So whatever. Okay, there is a king of this Indo-Greek world because it's really far east. And he is known for his sharp intellect and love of philosophical debate. And one day he welcomes the Buddhist monk Nagasena, and he questions him, hoping to, catch him in an inconsistency. So I'm going to kind of give you this little dialogue. King Melinda says to Nagasena, "Tell me, monk, what is your name?" Nagasena says, "I am called Nagasena, your majesty." The king says, "And this Nagasena, is this truly you? Is your body Nagasena? What is this Nagasena exactly?" And Nagasena says, "No, your majesty, it's not my body." And the king says, "Well, then are your sensations Nagasena? Or your feelings, your perceptions, your thoughts?" Nagasena says, "No, your majesty." Okay, the king says, "Is your consciousness Nagasena?" And Nagasena says, "No." The king, now getting frustrated, "Then is Nagasena the collection of all these things?" Nagasena says, "No, your majesty." "Then I must ask plainly, where is Nagasena? I see a man sitting before me. I hear you speak, yet you deny that any part of you is Nagasena. Are you lying to me?" Nagasena, the monk, says very calmly, they're all Zen and stuff, "Your majesty, how did you arrive here today?" The king says, "In my chariot, of course." Nagasena says, "Then please tell me, what is the chariot? Is it the wheels?" "No." "Is it the axle?" King says, "No." "Is it the frame?" The king says, "No" again. "Is it the collection of wheels, axle, and frame?" The king says, "No, it's not quite right either." Nagasena says, "Then, your majesty, where is the chariot?" The king says, "Chariot is only a name, a convenient way of speaking. It refers to the arrangement of its parts." And so Nagasena says, "Just so, your majesty. And in the same way, Nagasena is only a name, a way of speaking about the body, sensations, perceptions, thoughts, and consciousness taken together. There is no separate self behind them." Okay, I don't know if that was sufficiently cryptic for you. I hope it was. But what exactly is being said here? What is being questioned is whether or not the cogito argument actually proves the existence of a persistent, independent self that carries Descartes' personal identity. What Nagasena is basically saying, except never actually says it, just as motion does not require a separate chariot substance. Thinking may not require a separate thinking substance. It is, according to this way of thinking, a conceit that we all have that there is an I behind our thoughts. Now, this is incredibly Eastern. Let me be very clear as to what's being said. First of all, this does not deny experience. You, as you're sitting there right now, I'm positive that you are seeing images. I'm positive that you are hearing my voice. I am positive that you are aware that you are seeing images and hearing my voice. What Nagasena is saying, though, is he's saying having an experience, a conscious experience, does not prove the existence of a self, of a thing like self. So, according to Nagasena, Descartes shows us that thinking itself cannot be doubted. That part's true. If there is, doubting going on, there is thinking going on. What Nagasena is getting at is involves a different question. Does thinking require a thinker, or just thinking? Can thinking be done just without a thinker? So, of course, we are not explaining this thoroughly because we would have to get into Buddhism for all of this. But a very central tenet of Buddhism has to do with the way that we construe the self. And they have some, Pali words for this, but here are the basic gists of this tenet. There is no eternal self, and by the way, Descartes believes that his soul is eternal. There is no stable perceiver or haver of thoughts. You might have heard that saying that you never step into the same river twice because you are not the same and the river is not the same. That's the same idea here. You change over time. Your likes, your dislikes, your thoughts. There is nothing having the thoughts. The thoughts are just there. And awareness of the thoughts makes you believe there is an I there. But Buddhists deny this, right? They say, well, it seems that way, but it's not. There is no essential self, right? Tied to a notion of personal identity. Your awareness of a thought, of a perception, of whatever, it doesn't mean that you have a persistent personal identity. Descartes, by realizing that he's thinking when he's doubting, he doesn't establish that, Descartes' personal identity is real. How could he? It's just a moment when he realizes where he's thinking. It doesn't connect to some identity where he likes these things and he doesn't like those things. And, there's no connection there. And there is no self as a thing that originates or causes anything. You don't need a self to have thoughts. You don't need a self to cause thoughts to arise. The self is itself a thought that arises and goes away. Now, we will eventually dive deeper into Buddhism, but initially here, all we want to do is make that challenge to Descartes. Does awareness that you're thinking really establish the existence of the self that Descartes wants to establish, his soul as a thinking substance? The Buddhists would say no, right? So maybe this is not quite a knockdown argument. Maybe I'm just presenting two alternatives to get you to at least see that, well, maybe this whole I think, therefore I am is not indubitable, right? Maybe you can question it. So there you go. And unfortunately, this changes, if you take the Buddhist perspective, it changes the argument. I think, therefore I am becomes something with a little bit less of a ring, right? It's something like, doubting is thinking, therefore there is a thought when doubting is occurring. That's not, doesn't kind of roll off the tongue, you know? Not only that, though, this eliminates the inference from thinking to a thinking thing, which is one of Descartes' foundational beliefs. And so there you go. Maybe a little difficult to grasp, but there is a challenge there to Descartes' cogito argument. Now, there is another view that we can challenge, that fourth view, D, which I mentioned earlier, this idea that you are born with ideas inside your head. And to understand that, we're going to look at a division of thinkers that has been very, I guess I should say, important in the history of philosophy. There's two camps of thinkers that retrospectively historians of philosophy have kind of lumped together. On the right-hand side here, we have Descartes and Spinoza and Leibniz. We will talk about them later. But these are known as the rationalists. And on the left, we have in the center John Locke, and that's the person we will be covering, but also David Hume, bottom left, and George Berkeley, top left. So these two they're called the empiricists, by the way. And so I guess one thing I should say real quick is that if you were to ask them whether they're a camp, they would probably say no. They would say, no, I argue against these other people all the time, right? Everyone here argues against everyone else. So it's not that, they would have thought of themselves as being in the same camp, but for our purposes, we will realize that lumping them together helps us understand the basic distinction between their approaches to knowledge. And so, well, I guess we should get to that right now. So we've been looking at Descartes' four foundational truths. Purportedly, he can get us from these four truths all the way to the knowledge of everything that we have a clear and distinct perception of, and that, among other things, allows him to do science and all kinds of things that he wants to do without getting in trouble. This is maybe where I can mention that it was the case that he was talking about an evil demon causing us to be able to doubt everything. So now you can see his overall project as really having that, being driven by this desire to reconcile faith and reason. If demons are associated with doubt, well, then pray tell, what does God give you? God is the one that gives you knowledge, right? So he is trying to, he's selling it, right? He's definitely giving us what he believes is a strong philosophical foundation for understanding reality. And he's emphasizing that this need not be in any way counter to faith, the Christian faith. He was a Catholic, by the way. So that is where we were, and we went ahead and saw that, taken as a group, it's not clear, it's not obvious that they can take us all the way to the promised land of, absolute certainty in everything that we see. And in fact, even if we, don't take them as a group, but start questioning each of them individually, we see that there might be some holes in these, right? So we took some time to take a look at the Buddhist perspective and how that might cause us to doubt the truth of this first proposition here. He, at the moment he is existing, must exist. I'm going to go in a different direction now. And let's look at this idea here, proposition, the fourth one, D. The mind has within it the ideas of perfection, space, time, and motion. This is known, or these built-in ideas, they're known as innate ideas, ideas that you're born with. And some philosophers of the era didn't find that view terribly attractive. So now we move into the views of John Locke. John Locke has an interesting history. He was a physician and also a philosopher, also a political philosopher in particular. But today we will be looking at his views on epistemology coming from an essay concerning human understanding, 1689. So, he does not think we have innate ideas, and he gives us a nice, neat argument to convince us of that. Premise one, if humans really had innate ideas, for example, our idea of self, of perfection, of God, of logical principles, whatever, then young children would understand them, right? If they, if we come out of the box with these ideas, well, then those creatures that literally just came out of the box should have those ideas in them, right? Young children should have an idea of perfection, of God, or whatever, right? But children don't show any or much comprehension of these particular ideas. They have to be taught. Therefore, humans aren't born with innate ideas. As you can tell, the whole force of the argument hinges on that premise too. And we can think about this for a second. I mean, it really is the case that kids are not terribly well informed about a lot of things that we might say are the kind of ideas that Descartes was getting at with the idea of perfection. Kids will do anything until you teach them to not do that. They will draw on your walls. They will eat things they're not supposed to eat, play with things that are dangerous. They will put their hand on a hot stove and whatever. Of course, when it comes to things like an idea of a perfect God, I'm actually sure that a lot of you can, if you grew up in a religious household, the theology of very young children is sometimes a little askew. It's kind of hilarious, actually. I remember personally that I would ask if God could handle a lot of spicy food because at the time, everyone that I thought was awesome in my life when I was a kid apparently liked spicy food. And so I figured, well, God is even better, right? So he must be able to handle a lot of spicy food. That question doesn't even make any sense, right? It's not a physical being. He doesn't have a mouth. God doesn't have a mouth. So, the whole idea that children come out of the box knowing ideas of a perfect being like God, that doesn't really pass the smell test. Do they have an idea of self? Maybe, but doesn't it take a long time to discover who you are, what you're really about? That doesn't seem to be the case that we also come out of the box knowing. How about of logical principles? I teach symbolic logic. I can tell you with a considerable degree of confidence that most people don't come out of the box knowing how to do logic or how to apply logical principles. You have to be taught to do it. And so, well, all that counts against this idea that these concepts come embedded in us. It must be the case, John Locke would say about Mr. Descartes, that Descartes learned these things at some point, and that's why they're intuitive to him. They're very well integrated, but he didn't come out of the box knowing them. Okay, well, if you're beginning to like some of Locke's ideas, let's have a little checklist here. See if by the end of the lesson you are a Lockean. First of all, he rejects this notion of innate ideas. If that sounds good to you, we'll check that off. Let's keep going here. According to Locke, we are born with a blank slate. What this hypothesis amounts to is that humans are born with the Latin phrase a tabula rasa, or blank slate. In other words, we are born not knowing anything. So, no, the mind doesn't have any innate ideas within it. Everything that we know is acquired through sensory experience and, of course, reflection on that sensory experience. John Locke is incredibly clear about this, right? I have a direct quote from the man. Let us then suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas. How comes it to be furnished? Whence has it all the materials of reason and knowledge? To this I answer in one word, from experience. In that all our knowledge is founded, and from that it ultimately derives itself. So there you go, the senses, your eyes, your ears, when you touch things, when you smell things, when you taste things, that's how you come to know everything. You are born with zero knowledge, and then you go and passively experience things through your senses, and that's how you get your ideas of everything. And that goes from, what watermelon tastes like, what the sound of birds is, to, eventually mathematical principles, and of course, theology. All of that is acquired over time. This view that everything we know comes from sensory experience is known as empiricism. Now, the key aspect that I want to stress right now is that it is right? Sensory experience alone. Nothing else helps you acquire the basic building blocks of knowledge. Anything that enters your mind is either a product of sensory experience or a product of your ideas of sensory experience, things that you already have in your mind that you put together in your mind. There is, therefore, no possibility of separating knowledge from the subjective condition of the knower. We build up our personal knowledge structures on our own, in our minds, right? Through the information that we get from the senses. So let's go back here to this slide where we have, on the one hand, the rationalists who are, let's just say that Descartes is our poster child for them at the moment. And John Locke will be the representative for empiricism. Now you can kind of tell the difference. The rationalists, they basically believe that you can get a sort of a bird's eye view of reality. You can come to know everything, typically through mathematics. They are very much fans of mathematics and logic. And through this, they think, we can discover mathematics from pure reason. And from that, we discover the nature of reality sort of from above, right? It's very top-down kind of approach. Or maybe another way to put it is it's an inside-out kind of approach. Essentially, you begin with the foundational truths in your mind that you come to discover on your own. And then from that, you build a belief structure that helps you understand all of reality. Well, Mr. John Locke is not quite of that camp. He is an empiricist, and that means that it's actually more so outside in. We are born with nothing in the brain, and all we can do is, go look at stuff, go taste things, go feel things. And so the outside world imprints itself inside of our mind, outside in. And that's how we build our model, our map of reality. But it's not perfect. So you can't get that deductive certainty that Descartes is trying to get. The best you can do is, let's use a little bit of jargon here, is inductive, knowledge, right? It's probabilistic knowledge. So when you distinguish induction from deduction, deduction is about certainty. It's an all or nothing kind of thing, right? Either you're sure about everything or you're not. But induction is, more so it comes in degrees, right? So I have a 95% confidence that my map of reality is accurate. It leaves a little bit of room for error, right? You cannot create a perfect map of reality in your mind. So if I had to break down these two views into a nutshell, empiricism, knowledge comes from the senses, and it ends up not being quite very perfect. And for rationalism, at least Descartes' rationalism, knowledge is rooted in reason, and you have to begin with things that you know from, pure reason alone. And of course, in the case of Descartes, it is those 4 foundational truths that we talked about. And then from there, he builds up his model of reality. And there you go. That is the rationalist approach. Maybe one last thing I can highlight here is that whereas Descartes had all kinds of arguments, for why it is that perception, the senses, are not reliable, he instead relied on reason. He says, well, reason's where you really want to, put all your eggs in that basket of reason. Locke says, yeah, obviously, the senses aren't perfect, but they're pretty darn reliable. And so that might be another Lockean point that you subscribe to. Most people, when I kind of, ask them which one of these is more reasonable to you, they usually go with Locke. They do like this idea that, yeah, obviously we can use our senses for something, but maybe not. Hey, maybe you like that reason approach. I'm going to let you make up your mind about that later. Let's move into simple and complex ideas. Simple ideas are passively received by the mind and have no other ideas as parts. These ideas perfectly represent the external world. So simple ideas are, you go around the world and the world imprints itself in your mind. And it's kind of like a typewriter. I think Locke uses that metaphor where you go look at something and it's like, the characters are being written in the brain and you don't have to do anything. It happens just naturally. Let me give you some examples of some simple ideas. I will use one of my very favorite topics is coffee. I am a fan of coffee, maybe caffeine in general. I am not an addict though, for the record. My wife though, maybe. Okay, so coffee has several different, if you have good coffee, by the way, do yourself a favor. Grind your own coffee beans, preheat the vessel. You got to warm up your cup before you just pour stuff in there like that. Anyway, once you kind of build a sense for these things, you can actually pick up quite a few beautiful notes of flavor in your coffee, and I'll give you some ideas here. So especially if you get a medium roast, a nice Arabica, you might get a little bit of a caramel flavor, or sometimes maybe a very subtle butterscotch flavor, a spiced rum flavor. I've had some barrel-aged coffee beans because why not? Sometimes you will get a light mouthfeel with coffee. Mouthfeel It depends on what you're drinking, right? If you're drinking wine, some wines feel kind of heavy in the mouth. Sometimes they feel light. The feel of velvet. I love a good, maybe a light roast might be a little softer and velvety. There's no way you can further break down these ideas. If you go up to someone and you're like, oh, this coffee has a little bit of a caramel flavor, and they ask you, what's caramel flavor composed of? You'd say, I don't know, it's caramel. There's really, you can't break it down any further. And so that's a good example of a simple idea. It's just like the basic atomic building block of a flavor. Now you might put all these flavors together, and then you can say, well, this altogether is the experience of drinking this particular coffee. And that might be the case, right? You might have a very complex coffee where you can actually, if you think about it, pick up all these things. And so in that case, if you're thinking about drinking this coffee, that is a complex idea. It is composed of lots of simple ideas. So let me give you here the definition of complex ideas. Basically, they're just ideas produced by the mind operating on ideas that are already in the mind. So if in your mind's eye, you put a bunch of simple ideas together, like I just told you about one of my favorite cups of coffee that I brew for myself, well then if I'm thinking about that coffee, that is a complex idea composed of lots of other simple ideas like spiced rum and the light mouthfeel and whatever else I said, right? So these are not as accurate as simple ideas in representing the external world, and that is very important. So in other words, it's kind of easy in my mind's eye to sort of invoke or think of the flavor of, what's a good one? Butterscotch. I think I have it in my head. I can literally kind of not taste it, but recreate it in my mind. I don't know how, but to recreate something more complex, like a very complex coffee, that's a little difficult, right? I'll give you another example. How about this? It's easy to think about maybe the color red or different shades of red. But now try to imagine a painting that has lots of different shades of red in it. It's hard to visualize it perfectly. You're really kind of getting a blobby creation, and it's only when you are looking at the painting that you can really kind of, okay, this kind of red, this kind of red. So complex ideas are just a little less, what's the word I'm looking for? There's a little bit less fidelity, right? So simple ideas are closer to the actual thing out in the world. And a complex idea, our map of them is just a little bit fuzzier than of simple ideas. Okay, so to sum up, out of simple ideas, you can make complex ideas, and you can also reflect upon them. So let me give you an example of that. I don't know, maybe you think the color blue, that's a simple idea. And the color blue makes you feel calm. Yeah, well, that would be reflecting on sort of the effect of the color blue on you. Or you might also say, what's another simple idea that you might reflect on? Maybe the, spiced rum flavor that I mentioned earlier, that reminds me of Christmas. I don't know why that reminds me of Christmas. I'm not even sure why I said that. But the general idea here is that simple idea might invoke some other memory. You might make some other association with it in your mind, and that would be reflection. Out of complex ideas, you form more and more complex ideas. So an example of that might be, you can take the concept of a car and take the concept of a plane and put them together in your mind, and now you have a flying car. And there you go. Two complex ideas fused together based off of prior complex ideas already existing in your mind. And there's also categories of ideas that can help you sort of organize your map of reality. So the category of horse or hoarseness, if you want to say it like that. Basically, you're thinking of a mammal, that's a complex idea, and you're thinking of a four-legged creature, and that's a complex idea, and you're thinking of a domesticated animal too, and that's its whole category. And so you're putting all these things together with a ton of biological information that I don't know. I don't know that much about horses, but you put all these complex ideas together, and that's how you get your idea of hoarseness, or the category of a horse. Maybe a visual would be good for you here. So let's start with simple ideas being put together. You take the simple idea of red and simple idea of sweetness and all kinds of other simple ideas, to be honest. And then eventually you produce the complex idea of an apple. Okay, there's one example. And of course, you can also lump together complex ideas. So as I mentioned earlier, you take your simple ideas that constitute the idea that eventually, the simple ideas that eventually constitute the complex idea of a horse, like this horse right here, and take some other complex idea that you have in your mind, maybe like a shark, and now combine them in your mind, and you get a hark or a shorse. I don't know what you want to call that thing, but it is horrifying. So the point is, you can put together complex ideas, and those are the workings of the mind. If you like those, let's go ahead and check those off. Maybe you're a Lockean. I don't know. Let's check off the last item here, so that in the very least, maybe you don't agree with Locke, but you understand the man. This view, it actually goes by a lot of names. I don't like some of the names that it goes by. We're going to call this indirect realism. That's the view that all we ever perceive is our own ideas, not the external world. Our ideas, however, are similar to the external world. What does that mean? Well, the world imprint itself on us as we experience it. But all we really, have access to is our ideas of the world, not the world itself. Our senses are like a mediator for us. They're the ones that are, taking input from the world. But what it produces in us, what we have conscious access to, that's all been interpreted by our eyes and ears and mouths and whatever, right? So it's not direct contact with reality. It is indirect contact with reality. If you want a visual representation here, you got Homer, and he's sitting there drinking a beer. And I don't know why, when he's drunk, he likes to look at people's foods. So he points his eyes in the direction of some carrot cake. Now, this carrot cake is not being directly seen by him. His senses are, light goes into the eyeball and it's upside down or whatever. And so eventually his visual cortex produces an image of this carrot cake. And it is, there isn't perfect fidelity. It is his senses interpreting what is outside in the world and producing an image in his mind, in Homer's mind. And in fact, there is no way that you can ever come into direct contact with the world itself. It is always the case that it will be mediated by your sensory organs. So, indirect realism. What you're looking at is a world. Your senses are reliable, but it is indirectly, and it is an approximation. It is not perfect. So there, once again, we see that basic difference between the rationalist Descartes, who believes we have deductive certainty in, what we see, and Locke, who says, well, I don't know about certainty. It's a pretty good approximation. You can have a, considerable degree of confidence, but it is not perfect. In a nutshell, perfect knowledge of the world is not possible. There's at least two reasons for this, right? No one person can interact with all the things in the universe to produce an idea of those things. That's sort of the less important reason. The more important reason is that by our very nature, knowledge of complex ideas is not perfect. We have to put them together based on our experience of simple ideas. But as we put these simple ideas together into complex ideas, the degree of accuracy goes lower and lower and lower. And of course, the world is very complex. The world is hard, right? And so, yeah, our map of the world is not at 100%, accurate. It's just an approximation. As such, well, we should attenuate our confidence. We cannot say that we know with 100% certainty what is going on, right? There is no, you shouldn't know things, you shouldn't claim to know things with a moral certainty. And that actually brings us full circle to how we began these lessons on Descartes, and we snuck in some Locke in there. Remember, these thinkers were considering how it is that they can help mitigate some of the harm being done by overly dogmatic religious convictions, right? Some people were believing that they knew what was right and wrong to such a high degree of confidence that they were literally torturing and killing other Christians because they didn't believe the exact same thing that they believed. Each person in their own way, Locke and Descartes, they're trying to get the people of their age to tone it down a little bit, right? Descartes was saying, okay, first of all, science and faith and religion, they are compatible. In fact, the work of demons, that's what causes doubt. It is the case that it is God who can help us achieve knowledge of reality. And so that's, Descartes' way of trying to, simmer things down a little bit. Locke, for his part, was saying, look, we're trying to build our maps of reality, each and every single one of us. And, we're humans. The way that our minds work, it's not going to be perfect. You shouldn't think that you have a perfect map of reality, that you know everything perfectly. You probably don't. And so if there's a little bit of a, tension here or there with someone else about their beliefs, hey, take a step back and say, well, let's see what we do agree on, and let's see if we can figure out why we disagree what we disagree on. So both of these thinkers, in their own way, are addressing the concerns of their age. But now the question is, who do we go with? Who do we side with? These are literally incompatible views. Rationalism begins with reason. Empiricism begins with the senses, and they build up entirely different belief structures. So they each have problems, and maybe it'll be easier to see this when we look at some problems with Locke's view in the next lesson. But for now, I just want you to think about what is the intuitive appeal of each. Which one would you side with? If you're living in the late 1600s and you've been exposed to both the views of Descartes and of John Locke, who are you siding with? Well, don't make up your mind yet. We still have to look at some issues with Mr. John Locke, and then we'll consider them in tandem, right? We'll even add there Francis Bacon. What is the right approach to knowledge? All that and more in the next lesson.